evening, everyone. Welcome to College of Charles Stern Center Ballroom for tonight's three-rabbi panel discussing politics in the pulpit by rabbis who have to decide on this issue as a matter of practice and policy. It has been many years since that topic has had the relevance that it has today. Not sure that that's altogether good news, but it does make remarks of our panelists unusually relevant. You have heard me say many times, and I'm not beyond repeating myself, that I think the three-rabbi panel as a hallmark community event for the Jewish Studies program. I say that sometimes jokingly, knowing the groans it elicits from my family, but also in true sincerity. Just as I am proud that the Jewish Studies program offers a vibrant array of academic courses, and that through our JSU Hillel we offer our students meaningful programs, social, cultural opportunities, so too, I am thrilled that through an event such as this three-rabbi panel, our community can externalize the message of Psalm 133, Hinei ma tov u'ma'na'im shevet achim gam yachad. How good and pleasant it is when our community sits together in unity. These panels have helped create and to grow a cohesive and inclusive Jewish community in Charleston. 19 years and 38 panels are quite a story. Many thanks to all of you for your part in this story. The three-rabbi panel and many more Jewish community programs like it are made possible by the recently endowed Parish Family Fund. I have long admired Charlotte and the late Stanley's passion for dedication to this community, as well as the many incredible traits that brought to endeavors, both secular and Jewish. The late Dr. Stanley Carish was the first, and for many, many years, the only life member of the Jewish Studies Advisory Board at the College of Charleston. Stanley was a quintessential mensch, intellectually engaged, soft-spoken, well-respected, with a quiet grace that was infectious. I've long felt very grateful for Charlotte and Stanley's friendship, and now am also deeply appreciative of the family support of Jewish Studies community programming. Charlotte and her daughter Gail are here tonight. Please join me in thanking them with a round of applause. I'm very happy to see so many students with us tonight. Please pay special attention to the challah for hunger table in the back of the room. All funds generated by the sale of challahs, which the students baked, go back to charity. Please purchase a challah on the way out after the event. I would like to introduce Professor Joshua Shaines of the Jewish Studies program, who will moderate the panel tonight. Josh is a very popular teacher in our program, you'll see why, and a specialist in 20th century Jewish political movements. It will be a joy for me to sit among you without watching the clock. Josh, that's your job. And listen to our religious leaders engage in a topical and important discussion. Josh Shaines.
Good evening. I'm Joshua Shaines, Associate Professor in the Yaschik Arnold Jewish Studies program here at the college. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all, and particularly my students, of course in the back of the class, to the signature event of our program, the three-rabbi panel. Just a quick word of introduction for those in the audience less familiar with these Jewish movements. In the 19th century, especially in the United States and in Germany, Jews for the first time became equal citizens of the respective countries. Jewish denominations then emerged, each of which attempted to negotiate the relationship of Jewishness and modernity in their own way, each claiming that they followed the best traditions of Judaism from its earlier centuries. The first denomination to emerge was Reform, born here, as most of you know, in Charleston and also in Germany, which was based on the idea that the Bible and subsequent Jewish laws and traditions, as man-made, if divinely inspired, were subject to change and adaptation based on contemporary moral ideals. Rabbi Alexander of Kahal Kadosh Beth Adohim represents this Reformed tradition on our panel. Conservative Judaism grew out of this movement, agreeing with this premise in part, but feeling that Reformed Judaism had pulled too far away from tradition and insisting that Jewish law, halakha, remained obligatory, even as it argued that those to its right, in this case its left, your right, were too rigid in their interpretation of it. Conservative Judaism is a middle ground, to the right of Reform, but to the left of Orthodox, and that's really confusing because it's the exact opposite here, but you get the idea. Rabbi Rosenbaum of synagogue Emanu-El represents this conservative tradition on our panel. Orthodox Judaism was organized in reaction to the others as a rallying of forces opposed to these changes and committed to Jewish law as interpreted in the seminal legal code, the Shulchan Aruch, which details traditional Jewish religious observance. Modern Orthodoxy, represented here by Rabbi Davies of Congregation Dor Tikvah, celebrates secular education and integration into the modern world, even as it insists on a traditionalist approach to halachic observance. Tonight's topic, politics in the pulpit, seems particularly appropriate in an election year, and perhaps especially so in this election year, and raises a whole set of questions. What, if any, is the appropriate role of politics within the synagogue? Should our rabbis speak on contemporary issues like Israel, healthcare, economic justice, the poor, minorities, civil rights? Should they ever endorse or oppose a specific candidate? Or should the pulpit only be used for Jewish motifs, whatever those are, if rabbis have special training and expertise? Our rabbis will each have 12 minutes to reflect on their personal impressions as well as the views of their respective denominations towards the role of politics in the pulpit. We do our best to change the order of presentation from one panel to the next. So this evening, we'll begin with Rabbi Michael Davies of Congregation Dor Tikvah, followed by Rabbi Stephanie Alexander of Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, and conclude with Rabbi Adam Rosenbaum of Synagogue Emanu-El. Following the rabbi's remarks, we'll move on to questions. I expect you all will have some. So let's begin. Please join me as we welcome Rabbi Michael Davies.
Good evening, everyone. I want to start off with an apology. I've always heard that there are two things that people are not supposed to talk about in polite company, those being politics and religion. So we're 0 for 2 this evening. In a certain sense, these two topics, though, we've created a false dichotomy. Because our society creates a perception that politics is a subject in and of itself, and religion is the same. But this is not really the case. Both of these ideas, both of these concepts are about deeply held social values and how they play out in life. Religion is about how values play out personally, familially, and universally. Politics, how values play out in community, nationally and internationally. And people become very heated about these particular topics because of the fact that they're so pervasive and permeate every aspect of our lives. A few moments ago, my esteemed colleagues were discussing their ongoing back and forth about the Cubs and the Cardinals and their... I don't know any of this stuff, but generally speaking, and maybe some in the crowd might differ in this particular regard, but generally speaking, people are not really going to never ever speak to you again if you support another baseball team. Generally speaking. But in the case of religion and politics, people feel judged. It becomes extremely heated, and I think it's because ultimately it's all about values. That being said, I find it difficult, personally, to speak on areas in which I don't have a particular expertise. And as much as these two topics may be hugely overlapping, in one, religion, I've studied, I've had some training, I may look 15, but a little older than that. But on the other hand, in terms of politics, I don't speak politics. Not from the pulpit, and not here this evening. Because I don't feel that I have an expertise in this area. Now, I don't speak politics, but I may speak about politics, and I'll explain that distinction as I go on. But another distinction that I think we can make between these two very heavy topics is that, as much as it's very unfortunate, on the one hand, politics today seem to be one of the most partisan and polarizing elements in society, and it seeps into our community all too often. There are those, and I'm sad to say it, who will not shake hands, say hello to each other, let alone share any social interactions, because they have different beliefs with regard to our country's government and its policies. And the Jewish people seem to be particularly adamant in these areas. I want to take a look at early biblical narrative to understand a little bit about what truly drives this phenomenon. We begin with one of the first monotheists, not the first, but one of the first, Abraham, whose greatness came from his clarity, his understanding, his being on the other side of everyone else in his time, understanding monotheistic belief, and his commitment to that belief, putting everything on the line for the truth in which he believed in. Judaism teaches these traits were passed on to his descendants, the Jewish people, and continue to manifest themselves in a collective personality of the Jews. That Jewish drive is a neutral force, but it constantly pushes the Jewish people throughout history. It explains why Jews, as you've heard I'm sure many times, have won a significant percentage of all the Nobel prizes. It also explains, on the other hand, the disproportionate Jewish involvement in the early history of organized crime and major Wall Street financial scandals. Whatever Jews do, they do it big. This drive also explains the anomaly of Jewish political connection and affinity. From Abraham onward, Jews have constantly been trying to fix the world. Call it tikkun olam, call it whatever you like. But when we look at Judaism on a deeper level and the side of religion, it veers significantly from this great and passionate divide that political partisanship has created. I quote from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who says that Judaism is structurally unique. The only world religion ever to believe in a universal God, a God of all peoples, times, and places. And at the same time to believe in a particular way of life that not all people have to follow. Because just as there is more than one way to be a leader, so there is more than one way to find God. With Abraham, who we mentioned earlier, something unprecedented emerges into the moral landscape of mankind. A particular family and a singular people whose story will convey a vital truth, that it is in our differences that we are most divine. And by respecting those differences, we do most to bring God into this world. And I know most of us are already very much in our minds thinking about the upcoming Passover holiday. But if we can take a look back a couple of weeks to the Purim story, towards the end of the book of Esther, we read about how Mordechai and Esther, the heroes of the story, share the story with all of the provinces of the Persian Empire. And it frames that particular story as divrei shalom ve'emet, words of peace and truth. And we must seek to accommodate those principles of shalom and emet, to understand that it's possible for them to coexist, to maintain the integrity of truth, and at the same time live a life of peacefulness. Now, I often speak in my congregation about the importance of civil discourse, of being able to come together and have conversations even with differing beliefs. And I think it speaks to the eclectic nature of our Charleston Jewish community, and as I know a bit closer, congregation Dor Tikvah, in that there are so many people coming from so many different backgrounds with so many different beliefs, political and otherwise, which creates such a tremendous beauty in what we have in our community and what others have to share with us. To bring partisan politics to the forefront is something that causes us to lose sight of that beauty. For Judaism, as Rabbi Sachs tells us, the great spiritual challenge is not so much finding God within oneself as finding God within the other, the stranger, as we read about so much in the upcoming Passover holiday. In an age of ethnic wars and religious conflict, and I would add extreme political partisanship, that remains a monumental and still urgent challenge. Now, this doesn't mean that we can kick back, put up our feet, or sit on the floor and sing Kumbaya. We're blessed to live in a country where we can communicate, where we can lobby, and create relationships with our elected officials. And this is why when South Carolina primaries were to be held on Shabbat, I wrote a letter to encourage people to go in and vote beforehand, to make sure that their voices count. This is why I regularly invite my congregants to take advantage of the opportunity to connect with their elected officials whenever possible, in order to further our community and their personal goals, and through them, hopefully, the sanctification of God's name. Because there's a difference between talking politics and talking about politics. There's a difference between politics and advocacy. It's ultimately about a relationship and relationship building. You never know when a connection can help us to further our goals as a Jewish community. Ultimately, it's all long-term, as Mordechai saw it in his story in the Purim Megillah. So even if the policies, particular policies or character traits of any of the elected officials rub us the wrong way, I don't know that there's anything to gain by rejecting him or her out of hand. On the contrary, we should respect the office of the government and take advantage of the opportunities we have to create relationships with those individuals who hold those offices. So as I said before, I don't speak politics, but I do speak values. And rabbis should speak about values. Of course, we're meant to speak about what is most important. And the difference is that a value represents perhaps my religious, perhaps my rabbinic view, what ultimately is valuable from a Torah perspective. But I won't tell you which policy speaks to that value. Because if God could vote, the party affiliation would likely be independent. And the political platform would be the Torah. The concept of ethical monotheism and the values that come from the Torah have been the greatest moral civilizing force in human history. Directly or indirectly, the idea of one God and one absolute standard of morality have profoundly impacted history and have served as critical foundation for creation of the modern Western world. Values, not politics. So we do, as a value, need to care about America as a kind country. We need to care about Israel and what happens to our brothers and sisters there. We need to worry about our fellow human beings. But I'm not going to tell you which candidate or policy best supports these values. That's for you to decide. I have opinions about politics, but ultimately I speak values. I, as Michael Davies, may have an opinion about a particular candidate, but that is for me as a private citizen. And as a matter of fact, my own children don't even know who I vote for. And I'll tell you, even though my children are young, my 6.5-year-old knows just about every single thing about every single primary that has taken place so far in the election. You can ask him, and some of you in the room have, and you know this to be the case. I'll conclude with saying that I work hard that you should not know my political opinions. But I do work even harder to make sure that you will know what my Jewish values are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, Rabbi Alexander from Kahal Kosh Beth Elohim.
Good evening. Are we okay volume-wise?
Yes.
Okay. Deuteronomy teaches us, tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. Micah tells us to do justice, even as we love mercy and walk humbly with our God. Jeremiah instructs us not just to pray to the Eternal on behalf of the city in which we live, but to actively seek its welfare, for only in its prosperity will you prosper. The promotional materials for this evening's topic, as we heard, ask, should our rabbis speak on contemporary issues such as Israel, healthcare, economic justice, civil rights, or should the pulpit be used for, quote, Jewish motifs, areas of specialization to which rabbinic education is addressed? Well, let me ask this. If contemporary manifestations of injustice are not Jewish motifs, and rabbinic training can't help us to bring Jewish values to bear on social struggles, if the power of synagogues can't be harnessed to help bring us to the promised land of freedom, security, and equality for all, then at the risk of quoting Alexander Hamilton, what's it all for? Rabbi Eric Yaffe, in a speech delivered to the then UAHC Executive Committee 18 years ago, said this: Reformed Jews are committed to social justice. Even as Reformed Jews embrace ritual, prayer, and ceremony more than ever, we continue to see social justice as the jewel in the Reformed Jewish crown. Like the prophets, we never forget that God is concerned about the everyday and that the blights of society take precedence over the mysteries of heaven. A Reformed synagogue that does not alleviate the anguish of the suffering is a contradiction in terms. My colleague, Rabbi Marla Feldman, points out that this does not mean it's an easy thing to do, nor an easy time in which to do it. We are challenged by an overwhelming number of issues, each one central to our understanding of the prophetic message of our faith, and critical to creating the kind of society we wish to bequeath to those who follow us. And we are confronted by those who claim to speak in the name of faith, but who offer a different version of what God expects of us. Those who proclaim themselves the upholders of family values, yet who do not value individual rights or personal autonomy. Ours is a different message. We proclaim that maintaining a strong safety net for those who are most vulnerable is the modern manifestation of our obligation to leave the corners of our fields for the poor and needy. We believe that supporting public schools so that every child in America has access to free and appropriate education, and that paying workers enough to support themselves without having to choose between shelter and food, medication or heat, that these are family values. If we don't bring these progressive religious values into the public arena with us, then we abandon the public square to those offering a different view of religion and values. That's not a risk we can afford to take. And so it means that we, rabbis and congregations, sometimes have to venture into areas of tension. We cannot always manage to skirt controversy. In those moments, I take consolation from the observation of Reverend Jesse Jackson. If you're not controversial, you're not relevant. And I derive inspiration from a prayer that appears in our movement Siddur. Disturb us, Adonai. Ruffle us from our complacency. Make us dissatisfied with the peace of ignorance, the quietude which arises from a shunning of the horror, the defeat, the bitterness, and the poverty, physical and spiritual, of humans. Make us know that the border of the sanctuary is not the border of living, and the walls of your temples are not shelters from the winds of truth, justice, and reality. Even as we sit in the quietude of our sanctuaries and immerse ourselves in the lilting texts and melodies of our tradition, we must remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it's the presence of justice. The abolitionist movement, voting rights, desegregation, disarmament, all of these formative movements of activism in American history, and so many more, began in church basements. In fact, I began to make a list of the social justice initiatives that started in churches and congregations and quickly realized I'd be hard-pressed to name a single one that didn't. In the US, when it comes to politics, community organizer Marshall Gans has written, the institution that has had the greatest impact of working class and their participation in the country is not unions, as in the rest of the developed world, but churches. It's in the American political tradition for religious institutions not only to serve those in need, but to make claims on behalf of those in need. Not only to give charity, but to do justice. And so there really is no question when it comes to the mixing of politics and the pulpit in the United States. The question is whether synagogues are willing to use their pulpits in the same ways that churches have. Here, according to the Religious Action Center, is the answer of our reform movement. Joining a reform congregation does not mean one subscribes to a particular political perspective. In any group, there will be divergent opinions, and policymakers understand that when religious bodies take positions, there may very well be individuals in a group who disagree with the stated position. Yet our diversity need not deter us from fulfilling our prophetic mandate. Reform Judaism stands for certain principles, and those who join our congregations take pride in our long history of speaking truth to power. Just as most members know that a hallmark of Reform Judaism is an openness to the, quote, other, whether lesbian or gay, interfaith families, or those with special needs, they should also know that there will be a strong social action component. Mitzvah days, collection drives, social justice sermons, and education about current issues of concern. And it should be expected that through our congregations, we will make a collective effort to bring our progressive Reform Jewish values to bear in the community at large. We will be engaged on issues of local, national, and global concern. We will participate in interfaith coalitions and activities, and we will seek justice for all. This, the Religious Action Center says, is who we are. As KKBE has sought to live out this mission, nothing has been more inspiring, challenging, and fulfilling for me than our congregation's involvement in the Charleston Area Justice Ministry. The mission of KJM is to build a powerful organization capable of negotiating the interests of our community based on justice and compassion as shared values of our faith traditions. That power comes from two sources: numbers and knowledge. With over 2,000 individuals from 30 congregations attending our annual Nehemiah Action Assembly, and over 15,000 hours invested in researching best practices every year, we're able to directly address the issues our community identifies as the most concerning and ask our public officials to implement proven solutions. This direct approach can cause tension. We don't always see eye to eye. Those who in their leadership roles sometimes resent that we too have established guidelines and procedures just like they do to ensure that we don't merely gather to talk about justice, but to make progress toward attaining it. For all those engaged in the process, though, who are part of our annual assembly, two amazing things happen. One, incredible relationships develop. Charleston, North Charleston, Mount Pleasant, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, clergy and congregants, black and white. those who are participating in KGM are meeting others they simply wouldn't otherwise have the occasion to get to know in our community. And second, we're getting results. As a result of our work, more than 900 children now have access to preschool and a research-based curriculum through the Charleston County School District and arrive for kindergarten on the very first day ready to learn to read. A risk assessment instrument is used by all 3 police departments now, reducing nonviolent juvenile incarceration, keeping children with their families and enrolled in school to maximize their rehabilitation. A wage recovery program has been funded by County Council to help victims of wage theft recover their rightfully earned dollars that can mean the difference between having a roof over their heads and putting food on the table. And this year, this coming Monday night, in fact, we expect to achieve similar proven results. First, district-wide implementation of restorative practices and code of conduct revisions so that we can lower the 1,000 arrests that occurred in Charleston County schools over the past year and a half for offenses sometimes as obscure and minor as, quote, disrupting school. And second, an independent external audit of police procedures that have led to racially discriminatory practices. From 2011 to 2015, North Charleston led our state with 130,000 traffic stops that did not result in an arrest or citation. Charleston was second with 127,000 over that period. For comparison, Columbia, the largest city in the state, had 33,000 stops during that same period of time. And while 25% of the population in Charleston is African American, they accounted for 42% of the stops. In North Charleston, where 47% of the population is African American, they accounted for 67% of the stops. Everyone we have spoken to, including police officers and chiefs themselves, say that the most important tool they have in combating crime is community trust. So long as a community feels harassed by their police force, there can be no trust. I know that there are KGM team leaders from KKBE here tonight. I'm going to ask to raise their hands. I'll put them on the spot to do so. The 1, 2, 3 back there. They can provide more details about this year's issues and solutions, as well as answer questions about the organization itself. And to return to our topic, I will be speaking more about it from the pulpit this Friday night as we prepare for Monday's Nehemiah action. So let me conclude by returning to that connection, politics and the pulpit, and why it is that nationwide, congregation-based organizations like KGM are uniquely poised for success, with the observation of Marshall Gantz once again. He says, love cannot be separated from justice, and justice requires the use of power, the capacity to act. Congregations have a unique capacity to act because they are moral communities, and the traditions in which they are rooted are still capable of moving us to commit and to risk action. Friends, I think we all agree that synagogues should be places that help us acquire our moral understanding of the world in which we live. In the Reform movement, it follows that rooted in our rich and deep tradition of faith, synagogues should be places where we act on that understanding as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Last but not least is Rabbi Adam Rosenbaum of Congregation Emanu-El.
Erev Tov. I just have to say to begin, first of all, it is always a pleasure to be here with my esteemed colleagues. Also, I find it interesting that in all the commentary I hear, people say that they can't really relate to the candidates in this election, and I disagree. I feel like I have a lot of things in common with the major presidential candidates. Like Bernie Sanders, I am a balding Jewish man with bad posture. Like Ted Cruz, I was born in Canada by an American mother. Like Hillary Clinton, I have several email addresses. And like Donald Trump, every time I say Kiddush, I do so for the purpose of making America great again. I made that last one up, but... So in trying to approach this evening, I thought about it and I reasoned that the conservative movement is an historical movement, and we asked questions about how Judaism progresses throughout history. So it was fitting, I think, for me to look at the question of what is the historical role of the American Jewish sermonizer, and how do we fit into that today? Well, luckily, one of my closest friends, a colleague of mine, Rabbi Jenny Friedman, she was ordained the same year I was from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and she is now a PhD candidate at New York University, and she is doing research on her dissertation on this very topic. What is the historical role of the American Jewish sermonizer? And I'm indebted to some of her research in my presentation tonight. I want to mention a couple of names. First of all, Isaac Leeser. Isaac Leeser was an Orthodox chazan. He served as chazan of Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia in the 1850s. He also was an editor of newspapers. So he was already very much intertwined in the religious and political mix, and he believed strongly that sermons are the best, nay, the only way to provide adult education to parishioners. Now, this was at a time when rabbis were expected to be more educated than the general public, and with that came that certain intellectual authority. Obviously, times have changed, and thankfully our congregations are filled with many people with an abundance of knowledge and professional achievements, but still a precedent had been set. If you fast forward a little bit to the late 19th century, to the foundation of the Jewish Theological Seminary, from the beginning, there were always courses on homiletics, on the art of sermonizing. And homiletics were a priority in the JTS curriculum from the very beginning. And what they taught is that rabbis need to both look and sound like an integrated American. It was very important that we would look the part, sound the part, not only preach the part. And this was carried on most famously beginning in the 1950s by Rabbi Simon Greenberg of blessed memory. He created the foundations of the homiletics curriculum that we still use to this day. And Rabbi Greenberg demanded that students would not only know about Jewish material, but also good American material. I use that in quotes. Good American material. In other words, he would say that rabbis need to read the founding fathers, need to read American poetry, and certainly we need to read the newspaper. And in fact, that was carried forth in the most visible way by probably the most famous conservative rabbi of the last 100 years, Abraham Joshua Heschel. Many of you have perhaps seen the picture of Rabbi Heschel arm in arm with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as they were marching in Selma. This is the iconic photograph of our movement. If you had to have one photograph of the history of the conservative movement, that would probably be the one, because that's everything that our movement aspires to be. And in later years, Rabbi Heschel would also speak out against the Vietnam War, and he would write to colleagues, and he would say, "Why haven't you spoken up about this? Even if you don't agree with me, why haven't you spoken up about this? Our congregants need to hear your voice." It's okay for rabbis in the 21st century in America to speak about political issues. If we can't talk about it, who will? if we can't attempt at least to put ourselves in the shoes of the moral arbiters of our society, if we can't at least try to do that, flawed though we are, flawed as I certainly am, if we can't at least try to be a voice of morality, who are we going to leave it to? So what I'd like to do is tell you how I've approached a couple of issues from this campaign, to talk about how I've spoken about it at synagogue and how some have reacted to it and how I've dealt with that reaction. Now, for those in the crowd who have come to synagogue Emanu-El, some of this is going to sound familiar to you, and I appreciate the redundancy that this might provide. First of all, when it comes to the elephant in the room, pun intended, Donald Trump. I say elephant because he's Republican, that's all. And we all know that endorsing a candidate is something that clergy really, they're not supposed to do. There are issues of the tax-exempt status of houses of worship that are at stake if any rabbi, priest, minister, etc. endorses a candidate. So I can't do that, nor should I. And ordinarily I wouldn't go after a candidate and say not to vote for that person. And I didn't do that. I don't believe I did that. But starting in the past summer, when Trump entered the race and would make more and more absurd, ridiculous statements, and I think that's fair to say. I mean, he has said things he said misogynist things, he has said racist things, he said it. I thought I wouldn't even have to talk about it at synagogue. I thought it was low-hanging fruit. I thought it was just too easy for me to say, oh, we can't have these kind of statements. I wouldn't say we can't have this candidate, but we can't have these statements. But when he said that we have to ban Muslims from entering the country, even if he said just temporarily, that was too far. Because that, in my understanding of Judaism, in the way that I read it, in the way that I experience, that goes against Jewish values. Again, I didn't say not to vote for him, but I said we have to take a look at this kind of statement and say, we have to be able to call him on account for that. And I got a little bit of reaction from that. But later I got more reaction from another issue. This was the issue of Syrian refugees. I said in one of my sermons, and please understand, as I was doing this all within the context of teaching Torah. This was not a way for me to say, well, I'm going to talk about this candidate or that candidate, and oh, by the way, in our Torah portion we learned this. I mean, it's all within the context of teaching a lesson of Torah. I said during one of my sermons that banning or disallowing any Syrian refugees from entering our country will not make America safer. A lot of people disagreed with that. Some of you here tonight, a lot of you here might disagree with it. That's fine. But that was, I think, the first moment in which I spoke at my synagogue, and I was a little worried that I'd be able to finish. Interestingly enough, that Shabbat, it was Parshat Vayetze, that's my bar mitzvah Torah portion, and I chanted that morning's Haftarah. And a few people brought some candy and decided to throw candy at me as if I was the bar mitzvah boy. And so then I gave this sermon, and based on the reactions from the crowd, I then later went back up to the bima and I said, I bet some of you wish you still had that candy now to throw at me again. But of course, none of that would have happened, and because I love my congregants, and we have a wonderful congregation. And I wanted to do a couple of things to make sure that they understood how much I care for them. First of all, during the Kiddush, I went to the people that I whose faces I saw were not really liking it, and I said, okay, let me have it. Tell me why I'm wrong, or tell me why you disagree. The second thing I would do is, if they weren't in the mood to talk, I went up to them and I said, I still like you. Because we have to have a circumstance in which people can speak openly and feel safe. A synagogue must be a place where you can speak your mind and feel safe about it. And what is the risk if we can't speak openly? I spoke about this on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Again, for my congregants, I apologize for the repetition. But my stepfather is a Reform rabbi. He lives in South Florida. His main occupation is a professor of Bible at Florida Atlantic University. He signed a petition online that simply expressed support for the Iran deal. It wasn't a particularly bombastic petition. It was fairly straightforward, fairly within the political mainstream, whether or not, again, you agree with the Iran deal. And the amount of phone calls and emails, the amount of vitriol that he received, he had to call the police to ensure his safety. This is what we have to avoid. And my hope as a congregational rabbi is to provide an atmosphere in which I can feel safe speaking about the issues that are so important to our heart, so important to our future. And I can enable, I pray, congregants, everyone who enters our doors, to feel the exact same. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. We are now going to open the floor to questions, and I want to encourage especially the students who have shown up to be brave and raise your hand. I have an eye out on you. I also want to evoke a phrase that was used once before by Gershom Gornberg, if I may, which is, and forgive me, a question is a short series of words followed by a question mark designed to elicit information from our rabbis. With that in mind, the floor is open. Please sit.
My question is for Rabbi Rosenbaum. We have some 11 million Mexicans in this country, illegals, the vast majority of which have committed no crime. They came here for better economic conditions. And I'll say something personal in this. My son is married to a so-called Mexican illegal, and she is subject to deportation, something they're fighting right now. Why should we give any priority to ship Syrians across the ocean before we deal with the Mexicans that are in this country trying to earn a living?
Is it working?
I was kind of hoping it wasn't. And this is where I would say my level of expertise falls short, to be perfectly honest. And where I must understand that, where I think we must understand that the overall principle that I was speaking of when I was speaking of Syrian refugees is the idea of welcoming the stranger. Just as I believe welcoming the stranger is important, people from Mexico, people from anywhere who seeks a better life in the United States. That's the Jewish value that I wanted to impart when I spoke about Syrian refugees. And as far as the details of legislation, as far as the details of what the INS is going to deal with one way or the other. I'm sympathetic to the situation that you described within your family, but that's where I think that's what goes above my pay grade. That's what goes beyond it. What I wanted to teach is compassion. What I wanted to teach is welcoming the stranger. That's really all I can say about that.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask whether or not the issue of is it good for the Jews, ever plays into the question about whether you speak up or hold back in terms of taking a stand on a certain issue. The Iran deal is an example. There were many organizations that were criticized, both for and against, because of the impact that it might have on the Jews.
Is this for me or for?
For any of the three.
Pulpit.
I think that's a question that whether, nope. Now?
There we go.
Is it good for the Jews? I think is a subset of the question I usually ask myself, which is just, is it good in general? And generally speaking, I think what's good for those around us, what's good for our country, ultimately is good for Jews as well. Since he spoke to it, if you want me to, why I didn't speak up about the Iran deal. The important reason to speak up about that is the security of Israel, the safety of Israel. Bright people, thoughtful people, intelligent people on both sides of the issue found that supporting the deal or not supporting the deal would both, in one direction or the other, would lead to the security of Israel. I don't have the political mind to be able to decide which side is right or which side is wrong. So when it comes to Israel, generally speaking, my approach is to try and strengthen connections with Israel, period, which often can't be done from the Bima, or certainly can't be done from the Bima alone. It's why my most important activity as it connects to Israel is organizing travel and trying to get people to have that firsthand connection, visceral connection with Israel. And then if they're invested in the issue, they'll do their own research to be able to decide what they believe really can support the security of the country that hopefully they know of.
No? Sorry, please.
Oh, no, sorry. I mean, I think the question of is it good for the Jews, I mean, obviously, it has to play a role in it because, for the most part, that's our audience, right? I mean, for the most part, at least in the synagogue, that's generally the bulk of our audience. So, it does come up. I think, however, that, I think I'll just echo Rabbi Alexander's statement that thank God we live in a country where what is good for Jews is generally what is good for wide swaths of the population. That, I believe, is a blessing.
I think in terms of what I mentioned earlier, speaking about values, again, a particular value that we hold dear could manifest in different ways depending on which policy, and it goes back to Rabbi Alexander's point about two sides of an argument. That being said, when the Iran deal was going through the motions last year, I did mention certain things about the Iranian government, not pro or against the deal, but certain things that I felt that the government did, which I think is fairly accepted in terms of information, that I felt was a little bit problematic. I also personally, not from the pulpit, personally decided that I would go to Washington and lobby with my personal opinions about how I felt about the deal. Again, not from the pulpit, but because, again, myself as an individual felt that it was important for me to go and to speak my mind.
Yeah.
My question is concerning politics and with the recent
Hold the microphone to your mouth.
presidential election coming up. Choosing a candidate based on their political ideals for the U.S. and for Israel, and Bernie Sanders is socialist, and he's liberal, and most Jews tend to do that, but he's not really with Israel, and so I was wondering how do we decide between that, choosing the U.S. and Israel?
Okay,
That's a weird question.
so the question is, if you feel a candidate or a party is maybe better for the U.S. but not good for Israel, how would you participate in that debate? Is that summing it up?
When all is said and done, the way our country sets up, most likely, we're going to be choosing between two candidates. And odds are that neither one of the candidates will represent everything we could possibly want any individual candidate to represent. Neither party is going to represent everything that we individually would want a party to represent. We all have to decide where our priorities lie. We all have to be really diligent about where we're getting our information, about what our candidates and our parties stand for. When we say that one person is pro something, against something, whatever that might be, we see conflicting views about those things too. So we have to be really good consumers of information and researchers and all those great skills that we get in college to be able to do.
I try my best.
Right. And to speak to Rabbi Davies' point about lobbying, never, I don't think as any of our founding fathers set it up, are we ever to make a vote and then re-engage 4 years later. Whoever it is that we elect, and whoever that is that person surrounds him or herself with, and all of the other officials that are elected at various levels, those relationships are critical and crucial and important. And I've got some students back here too who have been learning how to be good advocates at the national level. It applies locally as well. We have to continue to say what's important to us. We don't cast a ballot and say, I agree with everything that's on that platform, or I take what I don't agree with and I walk away. We have to stay engaged at all levels. And that's why, ultimately, speaking up about an issue, it's not partisan. Because things don't have just a one side and the other side. They have so many different dimensions to them. And this individual policy and this individual practice that we have to be vocal about and speak up about how it is that we feel and how it is that it impacts our lives and those that we care about. So when it comes to November, we do our best based on our individual priorities, and then stay engaged and never accept that anything is hands off from us being able to have a positive impact upon.
So I think I'll just to reinforce a couple of things that I said earlier. I think as Rabbi Alexander mentioned, there are everyone chooses which issues are the most important to that particular person, as far as whether social issues of foreign policy, economics, however it might be. Everybody has their own feeling about what issues are the most important, and I think that plays to the fact that in my position, I don't know necessarily what the priorities for voting my congregants have. Some might be more interested in the social issues, some might be economics, some might be foreign policy, etc. So the idea is that if we illuminate the values behind all of the issues, then hopefully they'll be better informed and better able to think through which candidate they choose, depending on what kind of issues are important to them.
I agree with everything that has been said so far, but I just want to add one more element, which is a number of years ago I had a tremendous opportunity to be a part of a cohort of Jewish educators in an experiential Jewish education program at Yeshiva University. It's a cross-denominational group, all the way from the post-denominational individual on the West Coast to somebody who was involved in the Chabad social network, if you believe that there is such a thing. But in the course of this process, we learned about a number of interesting phrases and how to look at ourselves. Some of those phrases are phrases that may describe what it looks like we're here right now, which is a sage on a stage. Another way of looking at it is a mentor in the center. However, the primary role that we were taught to play as Jewish educators, and I feel that my role is as a rabbi, is as a guide on the side. And that ultimately, as the other rabbis shared, It's priorities that we set for ourselves that we're going to ultimately lead us to make the decisions that we make, whether it be politically or otherwise. And we're here to help guide that process, but we're not going to make the decision for you.
Any more from the floor? You see what I did there?
This is primarily for Rabbi Davies. One of the political controversies today involves what happens when religious beliefs conflict with secular laws on issues like contraception and gay rights. Well, you enthusiastically praised Abraham as a role model for humans, but when he heard a voice that he believed to be God telling him to kill his son, he was willing to do so. Had that voice not stopped him and he had killed his son, would you have viewed that as a mitzvah or a murderer?
So I think the question is, to give you a moment to think about it, I believe the question is if there's a value in the Bible or elsewhere in the Torah that seems to conflict with your value now, how do you reconcile that as part of this discussion?
Thankfully, the story goes the way that it goes. And I don't have to worry very much about that issue and grapple with it. That being said, I think that as far as my understanding, and I think also with regard to those who are politically active in the Orthodox movement, certainly from the modern Orthodox perspective with the Orthodox Union, that generally speaking, we want to encourage policy that will allow for the most choice for people, generally speaking. Again, I'm not getting into specifics here. Generally speaking, we want that choice because ultimately we want to be able to make our own choices in terms of what our religious beliefs are. And therefore, for that to be open and allowed in the general, on the general scene, is something that we view as a positive value.
Thanks.
My question is, why are so many rabbis outspoken in dealing with bigotry and prejudice on the part of American candidates, outspoken in opposing segregated housing as we did during the civil rights crisis, outspoken when in America people are treated as second-class citizens, but they say nothing when in Israel you have similar situations in which Arab citizens are treated as second-class citizens, in which Arab villages do not receive the same services as Jewish villages, and in which you have whole settlements and villages in which Arabs are forbidden to even try to buy or rent a house. When are the rabbis going to speak about that from the pulpit? When are they going to be as courageous in talking about justice in Israel as they are in talking about justice in America?
This rabbi, and because her congregation has allowed her to, has. And I do so because of what I said is the most important thing when it comes to Israel, and that's having a connection with our homeland. And when I get up and talk about those things, or even better, when we've got speakers who can come in and talk about those things, and I'm grateful to the Federation for helping us to make those opportunities available, we're not educating our congregants. And I've gotten this pushback. If you're going to talk about Israel and we don't talk about it enough, why are you going to get up there and talk about the bad? Because we know what's wrong in Israel, and it keeps us from connecting. So my goal is to show my congregation places where Israel is addressing its own injustices, and organizations that are doing exactly what we're trying to do here over there, connect my congregants with those organizations, because that's how they can have that relationship that I want them to have. Toward that end, as some of you know, the most recent trip that my congregation took to Israel was with First Scots Presbyterian Church, because their denomination on the national level had come this close to voting positively with BDS. I had a relationship with the minister who's since retired there. We connected with one another. We said, let's go. We're involved in the KJM and justice work here in Charleston. Let's go discover, and we've got, where did Rebecca go? She's hiding out there, and Michael back there who went with us. Let's go find the places that are doing the work in Israel that we would like to see here. And probably one of the greatest successes I've had in my rabbinate thus far is that same minister dropped off on my desk about a month after we got back this new glossy, thick publication that talks about 2 states for 2 people. A real role reversal from what they had previously said about what needs to happen in Israel. And because we went, and because we really addressed head-on what's happening over there, he knew what a positive step this publication that his movement had put out was. So we do. Maybe not often enough. It's a fine line to balance. As we said before, there's a lot to talk about. And we don't want to spend every sermon on a social justice topic. I mean, how do you balance the world and local and all of that stuff? But we do.
Thank you.
My gut reaction as far as why haven't, I guess, American rabbis spoken with the same level of passion, same level of frequency regarding injustices in Israel as opposed to that of America? I think the simple answer is because we live in America. It's not necessarily a good excuse, it's not necessarily the best answer, but I think that's the reason why.
Thank you.
I would say the same, echoing Rabbi Rosenbaum's remarks. The truth is that there are a lot of people doing a lot of good work in Israel, and there arguably are a lot of people who may not be. And the truth is, it's at a certain level, just like we have values and interests in things that are going on here, they have values and interests in things that are going on there. I personally have a lot of very close family that lives in Israel, my parents, my grandparents, my siblings. And I speak with my father regularly, and he has significantly more, if you will, skin in the game in terms of what he talks about, what he thinks about, because he's a citizen, he's voting there, and he's helping them to make the decisions that they need to make. But I think it's important for us to encourage them, yes, to make the right decisions, but to allow them to make those decisions.
Thanks. So I think we have time for one last question in the back.
So it's been stated that a lot of you will not endorse a candidate or specific political view, but do you think it's acceptable and or important to speak to and advocate with your congregation on specific political or social movements?
How would you define movement? I'm sorry. Sorry.
Marking the read.
Like any sort of specific, like the LGBT movement or gun laws or things like that, just any sort of thing that might coincide with Jewish values, but also just
Okay.
general.
So the question is political movements that define politics today, gun rights, gay rights, things like this. Do you feel a need to participate in those even if you don't endorse a specific candidate? And if so, feel free to give examples. Feel free to elaborate.
Okay, she knows where you are. How about you? You first.
I think it just goes back to what I said earlier, in that there are certain values that we hold very dear, and we each have our values that we're going to speak to, and those values will very likely fall in line with certain political movements and not in line with others. And I think based on those values, again, we hope that, or at least I can say personally, I hope that my congregants and anyone who is listening would be able to make an educated decision based on their own research and based on the values that I hope to impart to them.
I mean, honestly, I feel like it depends on which movements or which issues really speak to the particular rabbi. There are things that I feel more passionate about than others. There are things that I'm willing to talk about more because either it warms my heart or it makes my blood boil, depending on what's going on. So I think it really depends on what strikes the rabbi's fancy, and also I think a congregational rabbi needs to be able to read his or her congregation to see what movements, what issues are are they talking about, and to be able to at least be conversant, at least be knowledgeable about those issues as best we can.
So I get to claim Hannah as a student, and I was a chaperone on a trip to Washington, D.C., so she knows my answer to this question, but I'm going to elaborate. When my movement works, we have a Commission on Social Action, we have the Central Conference of American Rabbis, we have the Union for Reform Judaism, the Commission on Social Action is under there. We have bodies that make decisions on a national level so that our movement has taken a position on a variety of issues. As long as the issue is one with which I personally agree, and our movement has made that strong stand on, I don't know that I've ever said this out loud before, but in thinking this is definitely how I feel, even if it weren't something that I personally would prioritize. If a student ever came to me and said, this is important to me, then yes, I would throw the power of the pulpit behind their desire to see their synagogue stand up for something their movement has said is important and they feel is a value they want to see us represent. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to the rabbis for these wonderful talks. Thank you.